Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the show. And welcome to an interview guest who is just exceptional. This is Dr. Wendy Troxel. Dr. Troxel, Wendy, is a senior behavioral and social scientist at the Rand Corporation, and she is also adjunct professor in psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh and the Department of Family and Preventative Medicine at the University of Utah. Her research, gosh, I reference it so much. It's wonderful. Her research focuses on the interface between sleep, the social environment, health, relationships, sleep and sex, and also just the impact of sleep on society and also public policy. She is a leading authority on sleep in the context of close relationships, a topic that she's going to explore both in this podcast, but also that she explores in great detail in a superb book that she's published, which you can find on Amazon and all other great bookstores, called Sharing the Covers, Every Couple's Guide to Better Sleep. And the book, it's wonderful. It really reflects her deep understanding as to how sleep affects and is affected by our closest relationships. And this has come by way of 20 years of being a licensed clinical psychologist and a specialized researcher in sleep medicine. She's got an extensive research program. She's led multiple projects from the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, private foundations, corporations. She's got over 150 peer-reviewed papers. Her TED Talk, just go online, Google Wendy Troxel, that's Troxel, Troxel, Wendy Troxel TED Talk. It's such a great talk, and it has some wonderful key points as to how to discuss things that we need to change in society regarding policy. For example, school start times, how to improve adolescent mental and physical health. Wendy is driven by a commitment, the same commitment I have, to make a tangible difference to people's lives by way of providing evidence-based strategies to support human health. She's wonderful. It is my privilege and delight to welcome Wendy Troxel to the show. Wendy, after that introduction, I will simply say welcome to the show. Thank you so much for doing this. I know that everyone listening is in for an utter treat. Wendy, such an exceptional communicator. If you have not listened to her before, you will want to go and listen to all of her content after this, I'm sure. But Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Thank you. So let me just dive in. Your book, which has blasted onto the scene, by the way, everyone needs to read this book. It's such a great book. Sharing the Covers. People, please go search this book, Wendy Troxel, Sharing the Covers. In that book, there's a fascinating statistic. You mentioned that 61% of adults sleep with a bed partner. And by inference, that means that there's another 40% that are doing something different. Tell me more about how we understand the impact of these two sleep dynamics on, maybe let's start with relationship before we get into the common question, which is intimacy and the physicality of a relationship. How do these two worlds of people who really enjoy sharing a bed together versus those who are not doing that, how does that impact relationship dynamics?
First of all, why I bring up these statistics, I feel like in virtually every introduction to a manuscript that I'm writing, and certainly I spend a lot of time on it in my book, I think it's really important just to highlight the coupled nature of sleep. That is, for most adults, around 60 to 66%, or 2/3 of adults, report that they regularly share a bed with a partner. Now, as you suggested, that also means that a substantive proportion of people actually don't share a bed with a partner, even if they're in a couple. And I raise these statistics because this social nature of sleep has been really largely neglected in the field for many, many years. And it's only really been in the past 20 years that my work and many others have contributed to our better understanding of what it means for couples to share a bed and literally sleep together in the sense of sleeping, not in the sense of sleeping together as in sex, which is how we often think about sleeping together. And, I think that this neglect of the shared nature of sleep as a scientific topic, that has also led to a lot of the beliefs and stigma that people have about the marital or otherwise shared bed. And a lot of these beliefs aren't necessarily based in reality or scientific research. And so, in terms of what we know about how sleep affects couples or sort of what it means to be in a shared sleep experience, the reality is that there's not one size fits all sleeping strategy for all couples. And our beliefs about how couples should or should not sleep together have really varied widely across the ages. Prior to the Victorian era, sleep was really a communal experience. If you take the Middle Ages, people were not just sleeping with a bed partner, but they were sleeping with whole family units and other members of the household, in part for warmth, for safety, and the bed was the most expensive piece of furniture in the household. And if you then transition forward, for instance, to the Victorian era, that's when we started to see that couples who could afford it, that is, the affluent, would be sleeping apart, both because there was a belief that it was a sign of prestige and better hygiene to sleep separately. There were also some half baked science ideas at the time that infectious illness was spread through foul smells, including a partner's morning breath. So, best to sleep apart for hygienic reasons. And as with many things, what began with sort of the wealthy transcended to the middle class over time, also aspiring to be able to sleep apart if they had the means. And so for a long, long time, sleeping apart was really sort of the on trend sleeping arrangement for couples. And then if you fast forward even further to the 1960s and the sexual revolution, we start to see this backlash where the idea of sleeping apart started to be equated with this prudish, sexless image of relationships. And there was this real backlash towards sleeping apart being sort of what your parents' generation did, and that it was necessarily a sign of a loveless or sexless union. And that's really carried forward to many of our ideas and beliefs that we see today, and why those statistics, that 61% of couples sleep together, but that means a sizable proportion are not sleeping together. I think that's where sort of the eyebrows are raised and why it creates lots of media attention, that since the 1960s, we've really started to attach stigma to sleeping apart, and couples who are going to have intimacy, to be in a close and committed relationship, must necessarily sleep together. And that's really a lot of what my research has sought to do, is help us move away from these societally based beliefs and prescriptions about how couples sleep and really bring science to it so we have better understanding of what it actually does mean to sleep together or apart. And what I can tell you in brief is that there can be benefits to a given couple for either strategy, and it really depends on the couple. And I'm sure we'll unpack that a bit more.
We should absolutely come back to the choice of it because, as I think I've heard you say many a time, this is not a one size fits all issue, folks. And so there is no right or necessarily wrong way of doing this. This is a very intimate choice, and it's going to be an intimate decision as a consequence. But before we speak about that and maybe even how you have that conversation with your partner, I want to come back to that statistic of maybe 40-ish% of people not sleeping in the same bed. It seems as though there is a correlate of that, which is about a quarter to a third of adults that you mentioned in the book say that their relationship actually suffers due to sleep problems. Now, sleep problems, either one's own or one's partner. Could you maybe help me unpack two things in that notion. First, what are the causes of those sleep problems that produce sleep disruption for you, the unit couple, as it were? And
Mhm.
second, what are the impacts on a relationship or even on the health of those individuals because one partner is causing sleep problems for that dyad? Help me understand what those sleep problems typically are that produce sleep disruption in a couple, and then what the consequences are.
So there are many reasons why that roughly 40%, and again, these statistics vary in part because it sort of varies with society's changing beliefs and attitudes about sleeping together or apart. I think many more people now are willing to admit that they sleep apart from their partner. But the reasons for sleeping apart can vary. The one that we hear about the most with, some chuckles and giggles is snoring. That, when one partner snores, that causes significant sleep disruption to the bed partner. In fact, studies have shown that if an individual sleeps with a snorer, about 50% of their sleep disruptions are due to the snoring. And in fact, among heterosexual couples, women who sleep with a snorer are about 3 times as likely to have insomnia as compared to women who sleep with a non-snorer. So snoring is absolutely a big one, and it's something we often joke about, but it's really clearly no joking matter, both for its health consequences and also for its potential relationship consequences. But snoring alone isn't the only reason why couples may choose to sleep apart. There may be other differences in terms of your sleeping habits or preferences. She likes it hot. He likes it cold. One of you might be a morning person, a real morning lark, and the other is an evening owl. So your sleep chronotypes, your preferences for sleep timing are simply not compatible. And so you might choose to sleep separately in separate rooms or at least have different sleep schedules. Beyond these sort of intrinsic differences, it may be due to different work schedules. I've worked with many couples in which one member is a shift worker, for instance, a medical professional who works a lot of nights or rotating shifts. So he and his partner, for the necessity of supporting his sleep, have chosen to sleep apart because he's simply sleeping on a different schedule than his partner. Other issues include children who like to weasel the way into the bedroom and kind of make threes a crowd, whether it be a human child or the furry kind. This is also an issue that comes up for couples. And then there's also kind of differences in sleep habits that aren't talked of enough because I think we focus, again, this gets back to our history of focusing on sleep and sleep behaviors at the individual level only, instead of thinking about it in the shared context in which it often occurs, or at least couples try to have it occur this way. So, you might have a partner who likes to bring their laptop to bed or their phone. And maybe you're somebody who's really working very hard at optimizing your sleep behaviors to optimize your sleep quality, and you're trying to remove technology from the bedroom. Some couples I've seen have had a lot of conflict around these issues. And if there's not sort of movement in one partner to be willing to, ditch the laptop or ditch the technology and respect the other partner's desire for no technology in the bedroom, then that might be another decision to sleep separately, again, to deal with these kind of incompatible sleep related behaviors.
It's obviously such a sensitive topic. And I think one of the greatest challenges in a relationship is the concept of assumption that so often in our relationships, our romantic relationships, we assume that they know what we're thinking. And when
Mm.
they're doing something that we dislike, we actually haven't told them anything about our dislike of that thing, and we get mad at them because they're still doing it and they've got no idea. And sleep is almost an extreme version of this because it's such a non-conscious act in lots of ways that the person who is snoring may have no idea that they are snoring, and the other partner is upset and mad at them maybe during the day, and they have no idea why. They don't know why the relationship is starting to decline. All of which leads me to the question: how do you go about advising couples to instigate and have these difficult conversations? Are there easy on ramps? Is there the kind of John Gottman version of the soft start for this conversation? How do you approach this issue of, look, I'm sorry you bring your laptop in, or you actually move around a huge amount, or you're
Yeah.
taking the covers from me, or you're snoring? Have you found any Da Vinci Code for doing that in a couple?
I don't know if I would call it the Da Vinci Code, but I do have some strategies that have been, are evidence based in the relationship world and also sort of applied to what we know about optimizing sleep and the implications of sleep loss on both partners. What you mentioned is so true about how you approach the topic, especially when, we're talking about sleep, which is an unconscious state. So, for instance, in the situation of snoring, the snorer doesn't really know and certainly isn't intentionally driving their partner crazy by keeping them up all night. But the impact on the bed partner after another sleepless night, it is easy for anger and resentment and hostility to rise when your partner is causing you to be sleepless. And at the same time, these issues around sleep, and it's one of the reasons why I am so fascinated by both the nexus of sleep and relationships, is that they're both critically important and vulnerable states to be in. And there is so much meaning attached to what it means to sleep together, how you approach any issues that come up around the marital or shared bed. It really matters because it can often trigger some pretty strong responses in the partner because there's so much tied to the marital bed. And if these types of topics are brought up in an insensitive or kind of just, your immediate reaction kind of way, particularly while poorly slept, you might end up making your partner feel rejected, hurt, or abandoned because there's so much importance tied to that marital bed. So in terms of the how to do it in a healthy way, as you mentioned, yes, there are, sort of a soft start, not diving in and attacking, but also a well-timed conversation is very important. And by that, I mean, number one, make sure you're well rested. So having these conversations at 2 a.m. after nudging your partner or pulling the sheets back if you're struggling with a sheet stealer, that's not the time of day to have this conversation, nor is it first thing in the morning when you're both sleep deprived and groggy, or even right before you go to bed the next night. You really want to sort of optimize your emotion regulatory skills and your sense of being able to regulate your own emotions and your communication so you can deliver the message in a healthy way.
For those who are struggling with sleep, one recommendation I've offered in the past is meditation. Now, I was a complete skeptic at first. I thought it was all just, a little bit out there. But the data for restoring sleep was so strong. So I tried it. And that was 7 years ago. And I've been meditating for 10 minutes before bed every night since. The app I've been using is called Calm. And I decided to partner with them here. And Calm have agreed to offer a full 40% off its premium subscription to you, the listeners of this good podcast. So to get that 40% off, just go to calm.com/Matt Walker. And that is calm, calm.com/Matt Walker. And you will get 40% off your subscription. So again, that's calm.com/Matt Walker.
The other very concrete strategy I recommend is trying to use I statements. And this is drawn directly from extensive relationship research and clinical work. When I say use I statements, you want to focus on how the requested change in behavior or bringing up the issue is affecting you. So instead of, pointing your finger and wagging it at your partner to say, you're keeping me up all night and you're driving me crazy. That's why we need to sleep apart, or that's why we need to, find a new strategy. Instead, turning it to an I statement of, I really want us to talk about what's working and what's not working when it comes to our sleeping arrangement, because I feel like when I'm not getting the sleep I need, I just can't be the partner to you that I want to be. Right. So you're changing it around from a critical and finger wagging, blaming statement to instead, this is about me and my needs, but it's really about turning it into a mutual goal. And I always suggest to couples to really focus on difficult conversations about what's working and what's not working in the bedroom when it comes to sleep or anything else, but for that matter, to really turn it into how can we both mutually benefit from this? So it's not about the blaming or making the other person feel defensive, but it's really about what we can both gain as a couple from considering options or working on this together. So there's
I,
timing, there's I statements, and it's also staying focused on that problem. Don't use this as an opportunity to lay on all the other issues that are happening in your relationship. The more specific and focused you can be about this one issue, which by the way has so many other benefits for your relationship that there might be trickle down and cascading effects that can help with the other issues that, of course, couples face both day and night, but really trying to remain specific and focused on this topic so that your partner doesn't feel overwhelmed.
I love this advice. And in some ways, just sort of one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. Let's just deal with this and see how far this gets us. By the way, if the other person, however soft a manner you approach the topic, I could imagine I myself, because I'm wonderfully dysregulated, I have the emotional regulation capacity of a tree stump. But if that opposite person still becomes defensive, do you just simply say, okay, I'm going to back off and we're going to reapproach this topic at a later time? It's clearly that they're not in the right place, but at least I've introduced the concept, almost like Inception, the movie. You've planted the seed and maybe it will germinate and you can come back and have another try? Or do you try to empathize with that person and say, I know it's the snoring, I worry about you, I'm so concerned? And how do you, if they become defensive again, is there any way out of that? Do you walk away and say, well, first time try, we'll go back again? Or do you try something different, a different way in at that moment in time?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, this is sort of an issue that comes up with regard to all couples issues. In fact, most of the issues that couples experience are perennial ones. They're just, they're topics that we keep on returning to, whether it be finances or family or in-laws, work-related stress. These are issues that don't regularly get resolved. Couples just keep on returning to them. And in terms of if you approach this particular topic of sleep related issues with your partner and the partner is non-receptive or defensive, certainly, one of my favorite strategies is tabling the topic for another time and being respectful of maybe your partner is sleep deprived or just is not in a good place to have this conversation. I think giving both of you the latitude and the freedom to table difficult conversations until a time when you're better slept and you're more receptive to these conversations. I think that's really important. If you're not in a good place to have a conversation because you're sleep deprived, I'd like to tell couples to put a name to that. Sometimes just labeling behaviors, we have the word hangry to emphasize that when you're hungry and you're engaging with a person in a social interaction, you might be more angry. And so we have hangry, but I think we should also kind of be able to label slangry. If you're sleep deprived, you're just probably not in the best place to have these conversations. So allowing your partner to sort of have some distance, and particularly if it's because they're not sleeping well, that they can't have this conversation right now. I think that that's a healthy way to table a conversation and return to it. And it also gives your partner a little bit of sort of distance from this is not about, you dispositionally as a human being, not being able to handle this conversation, but recognizing that there is sort of a situation specific cause. That said, though, if this chronically persists, that your partner doesn't want to engage in this conversation or is dismissive, for instance, in the case of snoring, I see this a lot, and it's really the bane of many couples' existence. And it's really where, for some couples, I see a real unfortunate turning point. It's not just the sleep deprivation that comes from sleeping with a snorer, But it's that feeling of being dismissed and invalidated that many people have told me. It makes them feel like their feelings don't matter, especially when the snoring turns into a joke and this ha ha thing. The partner who's sleep deprived is not only sleep deprived and suffering in that way, but really may have some legitimate health concerns about their snoring partner. And so it's that dismissiveness. If the conversation keeps on being put off, that can really be a negative sign for the relationship and really needs to be addressed. And finding a new strategy for an inroad to say, I've tried to approach this conversation and you keep on avoiding it or getting defensive. How can we open this up in another way? In my book, I do give couples a lot of different strategies to have some pillow talk around their sleep expectations and just the experience of sleep so that it kind of can give couples an inroad to having these conversations when there might be some resistance.
Brilliant. Thank you. And let me cut to the chase, which is perhaps a question on many people's mind right now. We're speaking about the notion of how to correct sleep in a relationship, how to consider the opportunity, or at least test drive with an experiment, the idea of sleeping in separate locations. Tell me, what are the consequences of coupled related sleep disturbance directly on sexual intimacy between partners? And perhaps by inference, as a second part of that question, when couples start sleeping apart or they find a way to correct the sleep disrupting force that exists within the bedroom so that they can now still sleep together. When sleep is improved by way of separation or correction, are there any measured benefits of that for the specifically sexual intimacy of a relationship and the physicality of it? Help me understand both sides of that coin.
It's really interesting. I mean, we often talk about, and sort of anecdotally, people think about how sex is good for sleep. And there's this sort of widely held belief that that is truth. And the reality is, there's not really substantive or solid evidence on that direction. Where there is quite convincing evidence is that sleep is good for sex. And there's a couple of lines of evidence that I like to turn to that support this idea. First, there's some evidence that sleep is strongly related to a variety of sexual hormones, including testosterone and estrogen. In fact, there's a study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that found, and this was among really healthy young males, that after several nights, I think it was 8 nights of being on a sleep restricted schedule in the laboratory. And I think they were restricted to, about 5 hours per night, which is not an unheard of sleeping schedule for many people out there in the real world. But after just about a week of being on the sleep restricted schedule, these very healthy young men showed a reduction in testosterone levels, this super important reproductive hormone, at about 10 to 15%. 10 to 15% reduction in testosterone just after sleeping for about 5 hours per night for about a week. Now, that's really profound. And if we look at the flip side of things, what you can get from a good night of sleep in terms of your sex life, another study from some researchers at the University of Michigan found that among women, for each extra hour of sleep she got, so if we could increase women's sleep by 1 hour, there was a 14% increase in desire for sexual activity and actual sexual activity. So that's also pretty robust of an effect of what you can get in terms of benefiting your sex life from finding any strategy to optimize your sleep together as a couple. And of course, intimacy and sexuality is just one characteristic of a healthy relationship. And of course, I need to talk about the other benefits and consequences from a relationship perspective of sleep or sleep loss. But just from these very basic findings, we see this very strong association between how sleep can affect our sex lives. We also know that when couples are well slept, they feel more emotionally close, they're happier, they are better communicators, all of which can support emotional intimacy, which particularly for women can also support the desire and enjoyment of physical intimacy. So, in terms of how you get there and what the benefits are from either treating a sleep disorder, if that's what's causing the relational sleep disruption, or finding another sleeping arrangement, let's say, I can really speak to this more from an anecdotal perspective, which is that couples who, and I've seen many over my 20 years of clinical experience, couples who have said that either improving their sleep, for instance, by getting their insomnia treated, or couples who are struggling with one partner having sleep apnea or snoring, or others sleeping challenges, choosing to sleep apart, that they found that rather than that decision, for instance, to sleep apart being kind of the death knell of their sex life and their intimacy, that it actually brought them closer. Because guess what? A well slept person is understandably more interested in sex, finds it more enjoyable. So I think that there's often this concern among couples that considering any other sleeping strategy will be the end of their sex life. And at least anecdotally, that has clearly not been the case. By the same token, I want to make sure that this is not to suggest that I'm any sort of prescriber of sleeping apart. I think that's often
Yeah.
a misconception about me. I simply want to give couples the options and sort of a menu of what's available to them instead of keeping us in this tightly binned sort of optionless situation that might mean chronic poor sleep, because we know that chronic poor sleep is not good for our sex lives, and it's also just not good for our overall relationship health. So I don't want to be prescriptive in either way, but I do want couples to know that improving your sleep is a great way to improve your sex life and your overall relationship health.
So, one last question before I try to flip the direction of influence and just come back a little bit to how sex can change sleep rather than how improving sleep can change sex. But when couples make that decision, let's say that they have the conversation and they agree that a sleep separation may be a great experiment to try just for a little while, it's not permanent,
Mhm.
you don't have to commit to it. How do couples or how should couples think about the expression of this in public? Because it's something that I've been asked a lot, and I know it comes up. Couples, when they go out to dinner with their other couple friends, or occasionally they'll say, well, he always comes to bed and he does this thing, or there is kind of conversation around the assumption from one couple that the other couple sleeps in the same way, which is together. And then the other couple maybe has to answer one of two ways, either that they demur and they don't answer at
Mhm.
all, or they actually say, well, that's actually not something that we discuss or face because we actually sleep in separate locations. Is there a way that you advocate for or help couples think through not just the admission of it within the intimacy of the couple, but when you go out in society, do you essentially come out? And I'm saying this in a very respectful way of the use of the typical term, but do you come out the closet in the sense of we have a sleep separation and we embrace that? Or is there anything that you recommend? Do you face that? Is it a concern that I should have or other couples should have as they're considering this decision?
Well, this is exactly the stigma that I'm talking about, and why I want to emphasize that the stigma has varied dramatically across history. It's been stigma attached to sleeping together at one point, and stigma attached to sleeping apart at this stage. But I think what's happening is we're actually starting to see that pendulum shift even more. And while this isn't a direct strategy to help couples navigate the situation, I think we are seeing that there's, first of all, more discussion about the different ways that healthy couples sleep together or apart, and just sort of raising the awareness that there isn't a one size fits all sleeping strategy for all couples. And it's again one of the primary reasons why I initiated this work 20 years ago and why I thought it was so important to share this science with the public, because when people are making these sort of assumptions about sleep that are not born in actual science about couples sleep, then there's a lot of misconceptions and ongoing stigma. So even just sort of raising the topic that, oh, all couples weren't predestined to sleep together. And it also doesn't mean if couples choose a different sleeping arrangement that they're destined to have relationship strife or turmoil. That just sort of raising awareness, the more and more couples who are, as you said, coming out and confessing, admitting, owning that they choose a different sleeping strategy, that's also having a really widespread effect. I mean, when Cameron Diaz came out and said that she and her partner sleep apart, there was so much media attention around this, like, oh my goodness, this Hollywood couple sleeping apart, and oh my goodness, what does this mean? But I think what it did for many couples is it gave them permission, and it's a sort of normalization that couples, happy couples, have all sorts of sleeping arrangements that can work for them. And it's really not about society dictating how you should spend this critically important and intimate and pretty long lasting behavior. If you're getting the roughly 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night that we recommend, to allow society to prescribe that for you. What other behavior would we put in society's hands? It's so intimate and it's really a couple level decision. So I think there's sort of normalization happening at a society level, which I think can help couples overcome the stigma. I think how a couple handles this in a given cocktail party or dinner conversation, that's really up to them if it comes up. I think it's really exciting and empowering when couples who really feel that they're benefiting from optimizing their couple's sleep, however that looks, sharing it with others. Because as you know, we're still kind of coming to grips with how important sleep is for every aspect of our health and functioning. So at the couple level, couples even talking about, wow, like we tried all sorts of different options in terms of sleeping arrangements or strategies because we know how important it is for the quality of our relationship. I think that's a really powerful message. So turning it again, just as you would in a conversation with your partner about, we're really doing this to support our relationship. I think contextualizing, if this type of conversation comes up, that you make choices that are working for you as a couple because you recognize how vitally important sleep is for the quality of your relationship. I think that's another inroad.
A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker, which is a service that comes out to your home and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is going on inside of you. Hence the name Inside Tracker. They look at your blood, your metabolic signals, your hormonal health metrics, and then they give you a personalized, actionable set of lifestyle changes in response to that readout. And the goal there is to improve your health. I was looking and informed they have some new cardiovascular and new hormonal biomarkers that I'm particularly interested in. One that I'm focused on is something called ApoB, which is an absolutely critical heart health measure. And I get it done now with them somewhere between 4 to 6 times a year. Why? Well, my family unfortunately has a strong history of cardiovascular disease, so I am checking that pretty ruthlessly. And by the way, I do buy the product myself out of pocket. I don't want to fall prey to any of those trappings and undue incentives. Although with full admission, I still use my own discount code that you can use to get some money off. And that code for you is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. So just go over to insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. And again, if you want to get that discount, it is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Thanks very much.
I have heard couples even worry about what sleeping apart would mean for their children and what their children will make of that, seeing 2 separate beds or that their parents are sleeping in separate bedrooms. And my suggestion there is children are aware and they do see things. But again, with most strategies with children being age appropriate, certainly, but being direct and honest that mommy and daddy are choosing to sleep apart because when we sleep better, we're nicer to each other. And so we're doing this to make ourselves better partners to each other and better parents to you. And so normalizing that this is really, doesn't mean that they're headed toward divorce or separation, because even children can pick up on these things. But the children will see based on your interactions during the day that this is really about a healthy couple making a decision that works for them.
Thank you for putting up with all of my inane questions. Let me shift back to the inverse direction, which is not just when we're sleeping better, our
Mhm.
relationships are better, and our sex life can be better. But I think in your book, yes, sex may also improve. It's not just that sleep can improve the sexual health of our relationship, but that sex can maybe improve the health of our sleep. But am I remembering it right that you also discuss something that I hadn't been thinking about or considering before, which is how does the timing of sexual activity affect sleep quality? And if there are differences, morning, afternoon, early evening, right before bed, or if there's anything there in the data, are there any best practices that you recommend? How do you go about discussing even that notion of timing, which I know sounds formulaic and it doesn't sound spontaneity based, but just tell us a little bit about anything you know regarding sexual activity timing versus sleep.
Yeah, I think where this probably comes up in my book actually has to do with how couples navigate having different sleep wake preferences or chronotypes. And as you've
Exactly. Yeah.
discussed before, our chronotypes not only in our circadian rhythms underlying them, this not only governs sort of our preferences for when our sleep times are and our wake times are, but it governs all sorts of other activities our circadian rhythms do, including our mood, our blood pressure, our desire for sexual activity. So I think that integrating sleep and circadian notions into our couple level conversations is really important for lots of reasons, including this one, that recognizing and having the conversation with your partner, if you're not already very much aware of it, of what their chronotype is. I mean, most couples, after living with a partner for a while, certainly knows if their partner is up at the crack of dawn and bright eyed and bushy tailed. They're well aware that the partner is a morning person, or if your partner likes to burn the midnight oil, they're likely to be an evening person. But if you're not sure, if you're like most of us are sort of in the middle, I think as a couple, finding out sort of what your chronotype is, which you can do with some simple surveys, and recognizing that based on your chronotype, that also can determine to some extent your desire for sexual activity and your enjoyment. And so, particularly for couples who are vastly different, one's an extreme lark and one's an extreme owl, not only can they have challenges with regard to their sleeping together in terms of actual sleep, but they also can have challenges in terms of their sexual activity and function, particularly if one partner, their chronotype is driving the timing of sexual activity. If sex always is happening at nighttime, which might work very well for the evening person, it might not work so well for that morning lark who's just wiped out and completely fatigued and has no interest in sex in the evening hours when they're really on the downside of their energy and mood levels and desire for sexual activity levels. So again, it's a reason why incorporating these discussions about our level of compatibility or differences, and those differences do not mean there's anything necessarily wrong with the relationship. It's just identifying where you might be different from your partner so that you can negotiate and find compromise to find strategies, including the timing of sex, that are going to work best for both of you. The other way that sexual timing can matter for sleep, and there's limited literature on this, is for some people, sexual activity right before bedtime can be soporific. And this is, I think, where we get the old adage that sex is good for sleep. But for other people, sex, particularly right before bedtime, can be very activating and arousing in the alerting sense, not in the sexually arousing sense, after the act is done. And I've actually worked with many couples who this is another area that can actually breed resentment, because while the sex itself might be enjoyable, if the partner, and it's often the female partner, she finds after the fact that she's now wide awake and now she's very energized and it's disrupting her sleep, that can also lead to resentment and frustration. And again, that's where talking about how these very healthy, very normal relational behaviors impact the quality of both of your sleep, it's another way to integrate sleep into your couple level functioning.
And on that note of the potential impact for some individuals, the beneficial impact where sex can actually gift improved sleep, are there any differences based on sex, meaning males versus females? Do one or the other category benefit more or less from sex on better sleep, or is that just not very clear at all?
My assessment of the literature, and you may disagree, but my assessment is I think people automatically assume that the sex is good for sleep idea is more true for men than for women. I don't know that that has really been borne out in the literature, because the reality is there's just not a whole lot of good science demonstrating the effects of sexual activity with a partner on sleep. It's a very small literature. There is a lot of reason to expect that sex could be good for sleep with a, trusted partner with whom you have a close, good quality relationship, ideally, because in that context, sex serves as a way to bond both emotionally and physically. Such bonds can make you feel safe and secure, which is sort of an optimal state to enter into sleep. There also may be some direct hormonal effects of sex on sleep. And this is still a growing area of research that's also not entirely clear at this point, but it, certainly makes some plausible sense, which is that during sex with orgasm, both men and women do release the hormone oxytocin, which is, known as the affiliative or love hormone, and it produces an anti-anxiety or an anxiolytic response. It's stress reducing. It also can promote positive emotions and positive feelings and feelings of connection with your partner. And this could be good for sleep. The research in humans, at least, on oxytocin and sleep is very limited and mixed, I would say, at this point. But that's a really sort of hot area of investigation right now. But yeah, in terms of actual biological sex differences and how sexual activity affects sleep, I'm not really convinced that, there's a clear line drawn in the sand that, it's better for one than the other. I really do
Yeah,
think.
I don't see that. Yeah, I was curious. Although, having said that, that's one way to ask that sex differences question is, does sex change the quality of sleep differently for men and women? If we reverse that, does disrupted sleep in a couple have any differences in terms of who it impacts more? Do men suffer more from sleep disruption from their partner, or do males suffer more? Again, here we're talking perhaps agnostically, although most of the data is going to be from probably heterosexual couples. But irrespective of that, whether it's a homosexual or heterosexual couple, do men suffer more from disrupted sleep from their partner, or do women suffer more from that?
Yeah, and again, to emphasize what your point, most of this research to date has been in heterosexual couples, and it's certainly an area that we need to understand more in different types of couples. But in terms of what we've seen in heterosexual couples, I would say that generally speaking, women seem to suffer more from sleep disturbances caused by their partner. This is in large part due to known sex differences in the prevalence of certain sleep symptoms and disorders. So we've already mentioned snoring. Both men and women can snore and do snore. Both men and women can have sleep apnea, which is the sleep disorder associated most often with snoring, though men have a higher prevalence of sleep apnea than women. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to have poor sleep quality as a symptom or insomnia as a clinical disorder. So, in the context of a heterosexual couple, if you pair the male partner, who let's call them the loud sleeper, because they're more likely statistically to be snorers, with the female partner who's more likely to be the poor quality or quote unquote lighter sleeper, at least in terms of her risk for insomnia. So that's the subjective experience of sleep. Well, that is where problems can emerge, and particularly females can sort of bear the brunt of that disruption, because if she's already more prone to insomnia type symptoms, she is then going to be more vulnerable and more disrupted by her partner's noises or movements. And actually, yeah, and I want to extend that idea because, this is not all about snoring. There's so many other influences on couples' sleep and on these sort of gendered or sex difference implications. But what's also true, if you ask any woman after she's had children, even long after her infants are sleeping through the night, she will say that ever since I had children, my brain just doesn't fully shut off when I go to sleep. So I sleep, but I just am not able to turn that off. And that's really a sort of a characteristic symptom in a way that many women describe their insomnia symptoms. And this idea that women's brains really don't fully shut off during sleep, in part, may be related to their experience as being the primary caregivers, at least traditionally, that this might be sort of hardwired. I think there's some really interesting theories about this, and that might render her more susceptible to insomnia type symptoms, and also more aware of her partner's movements or noises or slightest perturbations in her sleep, that she's more affected than he just sleeps right through the night, which is a complaint of many women who are struggling to sleep when they watch their partner sleep soundly through seemingly anything.
Let me navigate through the hot water territory of any finger pointing onto maybe a topic close to my heart, which is, we're speaking about sleep here generically, but of course, you and I, and hopefully the listeners of the show, know by now, sleep is not just sleep. There's different stages of sleep. Help us understand how you think about REM sleep in particular, and how it plays a role in perhaps the emotional integrity or lack thereof in terms of a coupled relationship. I know there's been basic scientific work on REM sleep and emotion processing, but is there anything that you think about in the context of couples specifically regarding REM sleep, and any data there?
It's really fascinating, and it is limited in terms of the implications of REM for many aspects of functioning, brain functioning, specifically in terms of our memory and our emotions and our emotion regulation and processing. I really look to your work for this, and have for many, many years. I remember seeing you at a conference way early on in our careers when I heard you present some of your early work on REM and emotional processing. But where this fits in terms of couples, there's really been limited work, but there was one really interesting study by Drews et al. That looked at very healthy young couples. And over successive nights, I think at least 10 nights in each condition, they had the couples either sleep together or sleep apart. And what was interesting is they found that on nights when the couples were sleeping together, they showed about a 10% increase in their REM sleep, and also more consolidated or less fragmented REM. This is pretty preliminary data, and certainly more work needs to be done in this area. But I really liked the way they described the implications of the findings and how they kind of connected it to the broader research that we know about the importance of REM for emotional processing and for acting, as you've said, as sort of an emotional salve to make our emotions a bit less raw. So, what they suggested, based on this finding that when couples slept together versus when they were sleeping apart, that there was this increase in REM and more REM stabilization or consolidation, that they suggested that there was this benefit of sleeping together on enhancing REM, which then can have these social benefits because, in theory, if you're getting more REM and you're able to process more emotions and engage in this important memory consolidation during sleep, that could actually prepare you to sort of be more socially engaged and interactive individual. So it could have this perpetuating cycle of this social benefit of sleeping together. That was the hypothesis they proposed in this paper. And I think it's really fascinating.
A supporter of today's podcast is a comprehensive nutritional drink that I'm sure you've heard of, and one that I've genuinely been using for almost, 4 years to date, and I continue to use it. That is AG1. AG1, if you don't know, it's a nutritional supplement, and for me, I put it in my shakes that I make, my post-workout shakes, and it contains over 75 different minerals, vitamins, probiotic, prebiotics, you name it, and you consume it every day. By the way, for the record, I do buy my own. I hope that that's a testament, the fact that I'm using it, but also I just don't want to fall into any of the trappings of free product. It's perhaps good to also know that they are registered and approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. They also have GMP, or Good Manufacturing Practice badges and stamps. They are rigorous. So if you want to reshuffle the things that you're taking, such as multivitamins, etc., you can start by trying AG1. And you can try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of both vitamin D and K2. And for listeners of this podcast, you can also get, in addition to those things, 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. So go over to drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. That is drinkag1, all one word, drinkag1.com/Matt Walker, and you can check out that.
If I might just add to that, though, as you know, and I know, that REM sleep is just one dimension, one component of sleep. There's all sorts of dimensions of what makes healthy sleep. And there's actually other research looking at other objective measures of sleep, not architecture, which REM sleep would fall under, but measures such as, sleep fragmentation or movement during sleep. What's interesting is other studies sort of looking at those dimensions of sleep, and it's actually not that surprising. In this case, when couples sleep together versus apart, with these objective measures, fragmentation and the amount of movement that you have during sleep, and actually in the Drew study, they also found this with regard to movement, probably not surprisingly, when couples sleep together, they actually show more fragmentation in sleep overall and more movement. And again, I say this is not actually that surprising because it's sort of a physics problem, right? Like you have two bodies in a bed. Understandably, when the dimension of sleep that you're studying has to do with movement related phenomenon, it's understandable that when you have two people sharing a small space, that there's more opportunity for that type of, I'm going to call it sleep disruption, but it can be fairly benign or not. And so I think that there can be, with some couples, sort of this tipping point of, yes, there may be benefits, for instance, based on this one study, for many couples of sleeping together because it's REM enhancing properties. We also know that when you share a bed, there's just more opportunities for disruption because you have a partner who rolls over, makes noises, etc. And another dimension that has been studied, in fact, in those same studies that are looking at movement and fragmentation of sleep when couples sleep together versus apart, another dimension is just people's subjective sleep quality, how they feel about their sleep. So even when these studies have looked at how couples sleep objectively together versus apart, and they show that objectively, in terms of movement, the couples actually sleep somewhat worse when sharing a bed versus sleeping apart. When you ask those same couples, do you prefer to sleep with your partner or do you prefer to sleep apart? Most of those couples will actually say they prefer to sleep with their partner. So I think we need to hold all of these pieces of data in our hands and give this to people so that they understand, again, that if you're struggling with sleep with your partner in one dimension versus another, there's, again, no one right way. And this is all part of the complicated nature of sleep. And if you reach sort of a tipping point of the amount of fragmentation or movement that your bed partner, because he or she is thrashing around and disrupting your sleep, if that is overriding the subjective and perhaps REM benefits that you get from sleeping together, well, that's where you might decide to make a different choice in terms of your sleeping arrangement. So again, it's not this sort of all or nothing that, oh, well, this one study showed REM benefits of sleeping together, therefore we all must sleep together as couples, but also recognizing that there's discrepancy even based on our measurement of sleep. And that again supports the idea that this has to be a couple level decision about what's truly working for them and what are, if any, the consequences of sharing a bed or not. So it's really much more nuanced.
Yeah, I really like that. I remember reading that paper too, and it forced me to break out of my hard-nosed science mentality where I'm just thinking it's all about objective sleep measures. If a couple is sleeping together and their sleep is objectively worse, then it's definitively clear exactly what should be happening in a couple relationship. And then this paper came out, which is sits at a much more complex psychological, subjective level, which is to say, well, objectively, maybe your sleep is worse when you're sleeping together. But hang on a second, there are two human beings involved here,
Yeah.
and they both have feelings and they both have subjective opinions. And when you ask them at that level of inquiry rather than your silly objective sleep measures, Matthew, all of a sudden you get a different answer, which is, yeah, I kind of know that my sleep is maybe not as good, but from a subjective sense, I actually feel as though it's better for, I just enjoy it more. And so that's why I think it's not a simple prescriptive suggestion from the data, but it has to be a coupled relation specific descriptive set of conversations. Maybe last question, we'll get you back to talk more about this because there's so much more to talk about. But in the book, you explain what's called the four horsemen communication styles, or the four horsemen that are the apocalypse of potential relationships and relationship failures. You speak about how they may be related to sleep, or how you think about the interrelationship between those things. Maybe I'm misremembering that and I'm doing you a disservice by putting you on the spot and architecting something that was not said, but help me think through that if that were true.
You're absolutely spot on. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is a framework. It was created by the really renowned relationship researcher, John Gottman, and through his extensive work in this relationship research lab that he's conducted for many, many years, that's really looked at actual behaviors that couples engage in that are predictive of relationship rupture or demise. And it's a really useful framework. And in my book, I really wanted to give people some actionable recommendations. And I wanted them to really sort of have some tangible ideas about, oh, when I'm not sleeping well, this is something that really could happen to me or to my partner and that could really be toxic in the context of our relationship. So I really like this framework again because it's so strongly evidence-based and it's really well articulated. And it goes something like this. I mean, the four horsemen, again, born out of the Gottman research, basically says that sort of these most toxic relationship behaviors that are predictive of relationship rupture include criticism, and that's sort of when you attack your partner's character or their personality or their appearance, let's say. And we have contempt. This is when you treat your partner with disrespect or you mock them or you roll your eyes at them. There can be verbals and nonverbals and these types of behaviors. These are sort of the attack related behaviors that the Gottmans, in their extensive research, would see couples engaging during conflict that were predictive of relationship demise. And on the other pole, they also found these retreat like behaviors that were also predictive of relationship demise. And the retreat behaviors included defensiveness. This is like when you make excuses, your partner says something, and then you make excuses. Oh, I didn't do that. That was you. You deflect or counter attacking in the midst of a conflict with your partner. In the final retreat strategy is stonewalling, which is essentially withdrawing or disengaging in the midst of a conflict with your partner. And what's important about the identification of these four horsemen is that the Gottmans and many, many other relationship researchers have realized and written about extensively, all couples, including healthy couples, have conflict, right? So the absence of conflict is not the sign of a healthy relationship. It's how couples engage in conflict that really determines how healthy or unhealthy that relationship is. And what I did in my book is really sort of connect what we know about the impact of sleep on various dimensions of behavior and functioning. And I kind of mapped it on to the likelihood of engaging in these four horsemen of the apocalypse. So, just kind of to summarize, for instance, when it comes to these attack related behaviors like showing criticism or contempt, we know from sleep research that when people are not getting the sleep they need, as you've written about as well, you're more emotionally raw. Your emotions are, and your likelihood of expressing those emotions are much more on the tip of your tongue. So you're much more likely to lash out at your partner. That could be criticism, it could look like contempt. You're also less likely to be able to regulate those flashes of anger that we all get in the context of a heated relationship. But, we try to hold back for the protection of our partner and the protection of our relationship. But under sleep deprived conditions, when our emotion regulation is depleted, you're just that much more likely to say the thing that can be really damaging and hurtful and toxic in the context of a relationship. We have also shown in laboratory studies, there's been some work at the Ohio State University as well, looking specifically at the relational behavior of hostility, which is a form of contempt. And mind you, contempt and hostility is not only really toxic in the case of relationships, it's also really toxic for cardiovascular health, as it turns out. So it's quite a toxic behavior. And what we've shown is that people under laboratory sleep deprived conditions or people who are just sort of chronically not getting the sleep they need, that they're specifically more likely in the context of a relationship conflict to demonstrate higher levels of hostility, this specific toxic relationship behavior. And then when we look at the retreat side of things, the sleep work, looking at how that can affect things like your defensiveness and your likelihood of stonewalling or withdrawing. Again, it's important to recognize that being under sleep deprived or poor sleep quality conditions, that's a true stress on the body and the mind. So that puts your body and mind in a really depleted and sort of resource constrained position. So when you engage in conflict with your partner under these stress inducing sleep deprived conditions, it's very easy to become emotionally flooded. That is, your partner comes at you with a difficult topic, because that's just what happens in relationships. But because of your sleep deprived conditions, your emotions are amplified, which we know, and your ability to tone them down or regulate them are depleted. And so you easily can become just flooded with emotion. And when we as human beings are flooded with an uncomfortable feeling, like lots of negative emotions, we have two options. We can attack or we can retreat. And so that's where that flooding can also lead to that stonewalling or withdrawing and disengaging from your partner, because you kind of can't handle it. And we know that sleep is so profoundly linked with our ability to manage our emotions and work through that emotional flooding response. So again, that can be really toxic in the context of relationships.
I definitely know. I think I am very guilty of that. I've noticed when I am underslept in past relationship experience, I am definitely one for whom I just don't want to engage emotionally.
Yeah.
I know I'm not the best version of myself, but there's something about a lack of sleep that produces a state of reduced motivation. I don't want to work particularly hard. I don't want to get up and do exercise. I just don't even want to get into this with you. And so, in truth, I think I'm just going to shut down. I think I'm just going to stonewall, and I'll probably just walk away in some kind of pedantic child, throw the toys out of my cart manner of, okay, I'm out. And that's a terrible sign to stonewall. And it's also a sign of contempt too.
Yeah.
So I do think that this notion of when we are underslept, we are very much dressed in a different set of emotional clothes that does not serve us adaptively in a relationship and amplifies the probability of one or more, in my case, of these four horsemen emerging.
You're absolutely right. And again, we need to think about this in the context of the dynamic in a couple. So your strategy, sorry, not to put you on the spot, when you're poorly rested, again, it's not only that you don't have the motivation to engage, but literally this is partly a self-protection mechanism that if you're being flooded with emotions and you don't have the emotional regulatory capacity to manage them because your loss of sleep has depleted that ability. If you combine that, you might be with a partner who has sort of the opposite response. That your partner might be somebody who, under sleep deprived conditions, again, this is a major stress on the body, their immediate reaction is to be on the attack. So you can have one partner who is on the attack because they're not getting the sleep they need, and another partner who is on the withdraw and the disengagement. And you have this really unhealthy dynamic with one partner going after you and you're running for the hills trying to disengage. The partner then feels like you just don't care or you're withdrawing and you're feeling attacked and defensive and have no way in. So again, this is why we need to think about sleep as a critical component of how we engage in the difficult conversations that are just a natural part of being in a relationship, because we're all going to have conflict in our relationships. It's just how we engage in them that's going to determine whether we successfully navigate them or whether they can really damage the relationship and over time have potentially really lasting effects on the relationship. And that's where, again, using sleep and optimizing sleep as a tool to optimize the quality of your relationship, it really needs to be at the forefront of all of our minds. Because if you're not going to sleep for yourself, well, then do it for your partner.
Yeah, well said. And not only is this yet another reason for us to, if we can and we have the capacity and life gives us the chance to try to focus on improving our sleep, but relationships are so interwoven with sleep. It's impossible to extract sleep out of the equation of a relationship, both sides of it, a successful one and an unsuccessful one, however you want to define that. But yet, so rarely do we think of sleep as a critical ingredient in relationships. We'll go to relationship therapists, we'll read books. I don't know that many therapists, and I don't know that many relationship books that bring up sleep as a major chapter or a major component other than your book. And so I would simply say, in rounding out this first part, I will guarantee, I know people will want you back. We're going to have you back. We're going to talk more about this. There's a lot more to talk about. But folks, if you are even vaguely intrigued by the notion of how sleep is lace chain interwoven into your relationships and you want to navigate that better, please go and buy Wendy's book. Wendy, firstly, thank you.
Thank you,
Second,
Matt.
Wendy, tell us, where can people find you on the interwebs, that thing that all the kids talk about on social media? Tell us a little bit more as to where people can find your book, full title. Give us more about where people can find you more.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's really been a pleasure. So, again, my book is entitled Sharing the Covers, Every Couple's Guide to Better Sleep. It's available at all major online retailers. You can also ask your local bookstore to carry it and support your local bookseller. I have a website, wendytroxel.com. I'm also on Twitter or X. That's also at Wendy Troxel. And on Instagram, it's Sharing the Covers. And I also have a couple of TED Talks or TEDx Talks out there. One
They are
is
brilliant. They are
oh, well,
so
thank you.
good. Oh,
One
that's so good.
one is on couples and sleep, and one is actually on another passion of mine, which is the impact of school start times on adolescent sleep. So you can also check those out. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy.